Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
And I am your other host, Stephen Falgu.
And welcome to our amazing podcast, number 16, right here.
The big number 16, as it were.
The big 1-6.
That's what they say. It's old enough to drive this podcast. Put it in a car.
Man, that was a...
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a zinger.
If you don't know what our now legally able to drive podcast is about, Get Recc'd is a podcast where every week Louis and myself, two brothers, recommend to each other something from some form of medium, and then in the following episode we talk about it, give our thoughts and opinions, and then the cycle continues.
Yes, as it will for the 16th time. Once again,
as it will in perpetuity. Please free us. We cannot. We are stuck in this hell that we've created for ourselves.
It's truly a nightmare.
Truly an everlasting nightmare.
Yeah, and neither one of us can seem to escape it. So send help. Send your thoughts. You know.
Yes,
we'll make it out alive.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah. I mean, look, listen. Doing podcasts is extremely dangerous. This is practically a dirty job, you know. It's one of those jobs no one's willing to do because there's a high risk of death. But we're here to be your heroes. We're here to do what no other man dares to do, save for the other men and women who also do podcasts.
Yeah, every week we really get down into the garbage.
Oh, I don't disagree with that at all.
We get into the garbage. We bring up just the best jokes out of there, shine them up a little bit, have them for you all.
The best jokes in the trash can are still in the trash can.
Our opinions are objective, cannot be disagreed with because we really got into the dirt and made sure that we've created the best product there is.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
But like I mentioned, we are contractually obligated to do this for the rest of our lives.
And with that happy note, we'll move on to our happy album. Last episode, I recommended to Steven the album No Love Deep Web. I almost fucked up that title. I don't know why. By Death Grips. And I'll just let you take it from here, I suppose.
I like that we've censored.
Well, yeah, obviously.
We've censored the censored image.
I mean, I suppose that would break us from our contract, but...
Yeah, that's right. YouTube can't shut this podcast down. I'd like to see them try.
They won't.
So, I have something to say here. You and I, Louis, over the course of these 16 episodes, I feel like have been pretty generally agreeable. I can think of only maybe a few times where we've had slight disagreements, but even in those cases...
I mean, Filth was pretty big. Like, that was a 8 out of 10 from me and a 2 out of 10 from you, so it's happened before.
That's true, but even in that situation, I didn't hate it.
Oh, dear.
Even though I gave it a 2 out of 10. Spoiler alert, I hated this. This is the first time where I even listening through this, I was like, man, I think that this is going to be the first time that Louis and I are going to have a real heated discussion on something coming out of this podcast.
I can't wait.
Because I genuinely don't think I liked any aspect of this album or listening to this album. With that being said, I want to say the one thing that I did like. So, there's one track on here that I enjoyed listening to. Only one. Lil Boy. I actually thought that was a really good track, a well-composed track. But besides that, most of this was noise in a way that I did not enjoy. I like the live chat right now. Thank you guys. Thank you.
They're not going to let up on you, and as more people pile in, you're only going to attract
Let
more
me
and
have
more
it.
audience.
Bring it. Bring it.
I can guarantee you of that.
Like I was saying, it's like it was noise in a level that I did not enjoy for most of this album. I didn't like the flow of most or any of the tracks here. I mean, most of it kind of boiled down to either garbled mess or just like screaming, which is obviously at most points what they were going for, but I did not enjoy that. I'll take a pause here, Lewis. Let me ask you what you think about this album. Live chat's really
they're
really an interesting place. Let me ask you, Lewis, how do you feel about this album, which is trash?
Yeah, so No Love Deep Web is not Death Grip's best album. I picked it because if I picked Death Grip's best album, I would be giving another 10 on this podcast. And I don't think that gives an accurate depiction of the kind of critic I am. I'm not that generous, but I can come across that way if I keep doing that. So instead I picked a Death Grips album that I've heard many other fans say is their favorite, but I have a decent few criticisms of them, which I would like to add are far better criticisms than yours, which are just awful. I will get to those. This album, I would say, for the most part, contains only one of Death Grip's best songs, whereas I feel like nearly every other record contains a few of their best songs, in saying that they have a lot of really fantastic material. And there's a lot of fantastic material on this record as well. However, I think it's all loaded in the first half of the record for the most part. And now, I don't know how much you noticed it, but I definitely feel that the record fizzles out sonically. It fizzles out in practically every way towards the second half, where most of the tracks become a lot more minimalist, but not in a way that feels altogether interesting. So take the song No Love, for example, one of their best fucking tracks. This song is amazing. This thing goes so hard. I cannot believe what I'm listening to when I listen to this song. It's amazing. I love the way that the drums just sizzle through the mix here. That incredible reverbial growl that just kind of revs up and up and up as which is the one of the few sonics that the track has, and the way it shifts, the dynamic shifts that it has, it's absolutely brilliant. It's incredible, and it may be in their top 10. I don't know, but even forgetting that, tracks like Come Up and Get Me and Little Boy, Black Dice, Lock Your Doors as well. It's it creates this really cool, more minimalistic sound for Death Grips coming off of their album The Money Store, which is their best album and is very much maximalist. Tons of samples, just tons of effects. I mean, it is absolutely blaring. There's just so much going on in that album. There's so much to unpack. And even after listening to that album as much as I have, I still hear new things in it. It's just that much going on. Whereas in No Love Deep Web, you don't need to listen much to get everything that's going on, which I don't think is a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, I would argue that you don't need to listen to it at all.
Well, if you were picking, let's say this, if you chose to only listen to, let's say 3 Death Grips albums, right? I wouldn't even put this one. I would not even recommend this one. Maybe this is top 5. I'd have to think about it. But again, it's not altogether the most consistent thing in the, God damn it. But I still think that the material on this thing is super strong. I think the lyrics are super strong, which is something that Death Grips faltered with after this album. This album continues this paranoid, just insane, psychotic character that MC Ride portrays, which really fits with his vocal persona and his vocal style and his flow. Whereas after this, a lot of his lyrics kind of became word salad. But here I feel like there's a stronger theme. Anyway, I've been talking for a while. I'll get back to talking after I let you say something that will embarrass yourself again.
I think that paranoia is a portion of why I didn't like this so much. It's like, to me, it felt like the lyrics were often just close to nonsense. I don't think completely nonsense. There were a lot of lyrics that that reached out, but generally I feel like that level of that vocal sound and just the lyrical content just did not appeal to me whatsoever for most of these. So I mentioned that I liked the tracks. I did like Little Boy. The other one I'll mention that I liked a bit, Artificial Death in the West, which closes out this album. I thought it was a good, solid closer.
Yeah. Easy listening.
Yeah, just a nice, easy listening R&B track at the end.
Well, in comparison. I mean, it is. Like, it's one of their softest songs, which for that reason, I'm actually not crazy about it. It's nice. Like, anyway, keep going.
I only like the soft boy songs, so...
Right, yeah.
That's why.
Sad boy indie.
Yeah. I don't know. I felt like most of this album to me, and I think you hit on it a bit, it's like most of this album to me just felt like it hit you so hard in the beginning. I did not necessarily like that. And then I feel like I kind of tuned out most of the rest of it. Like the rest of it just kind of blends into this, sonically, it just blends into this very similar pattern for most of the rest of the album here, besides like the first handful of tracks where it's just like, I lost interest and like I mentioned, just like the way that it opened, even I wasn't necessarily interested from the get-go. So for most of this, it's like I listened to it multiple times, and every time that I listened to it, it just didn't grab me like others have grabbed me on this podcast even.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this record has such a strong start that I don't think the second half of this record kills it. And for the record, I like the second half of this record. I just don't love it. And also, Stockton is one of their worst songs. That song is crap. That song's crap. The vocal hook on that is like so annoying and stupid. That song sucks. However, that's the only dud here. That's the only thing that like is completely falls flat. Whammy and Pop are all right. But I think, Bass Rattle, Stars at the Sky, Artificial Death in the West, fine. Hunger Games is one of the best tracks on the record, I will say. And that might be the most minimalist song, and it really works. Like, I want to point out that despite the fact that I think that this album, despite the fact that I was criticizing it for being minimalist, or at least it sounded that way. I don't want it to come across that way because I'm not. I actually really like that they took that experiment, especially after the Money Store, which was, again, just so packed to the brim of sounds. And this album takes it all down a notch. But I think they do it really well. I just don't think it's as good in comparison. But yeah, Hunger Games is a track that I think demonstrates their ability to do that. And, with the kind of persona that MC Ride is trying to portray on this album, I think that this sound works equally as well as the manic, insane sample work did on The Money Store when he was portraying the same character. Both of them work, but they both portray a different side to this paranoia. One is the manic, crazed element where he's always seeing things that aren't there and doing horrible things and all this kind of stuff. Whereas on this album, it just feels more depressing. You get the depressing side of that. Especially on Come Up and Get Me, which is he's saying he wants to jump out of the top of this 8-story abandoned building. So I think that I like the fact that it plays off of their last record in that way, and I think that on its own it stands up. And what I'm curious about, Steven, is how you didn't immediately recognize No Love as the incredible banger that it is.
I don't know. I don't know what it is about this album, but I think so. Some of the things I mentioned, it's like for whatever reason, I think it came out of the gate so strong, and I didn't like what I was hearing. That for most of these, I just kind of they just kind of washed away to me. So, I guess okay, I would say this: as much as I did not enjoy this album, I mean, listening to it was fine. Like none of it was so atrocious where I was like, oh man, if I could turn this off, I would. Wasn't that level, but none of it, but again, equally, none of it necessarily grabbed me in any real discernible way. I understand what they were going for, and I think they definitely have a sound, and you can feel that like right out the gate. But like I said, most of it to me felt more like noise, but not in the way where we have had on this podcast other albums that had elements of noise.
Which
it
you
was
also
more that it just
didn't
felt like noise.
Well, I see. That's just really odd to me. I mean, I guess it's because I'm into so much weird music that Death Grips doesn't faze me anymore. But it's like in like this album sounds like noise. I mean, I'd give you, if you were at the Money Store and you said that, I would at least understand. I mean, yes, that album's much poppier and hookier. However, that only reveals itself after getting familiar with that style. It's still blaring. It's still a little lo-fi, and there's so much going on. It's so overwhelming to a listener not familiar with that kind of music, where I would say, okay, I understand why you would say that about an album like that. But like this album, sonically, there's not much going on here. It's not like they're throwing so much at you, or that they're I mean, yes, MC Ride's yelling, but like if that's enough to make the album seem like noise to you, I guess I just don't understand that. I mean, really, to me, one thing that No Love Deep Web does that at points almost makes it more accessible than the Money Store, I don't know which one I'd say is more accessible overall, but at points maybe makes it more accessible, is on a track like Little Boy, or even quite a few of these tracks. Like some of these beats, you could just put a normal rapper over them and it would just be a little off kilter. It wouldn't be all that weird. If MC Ride is the only thing that's making you reel back at it, I guess I can kind of understand, but like it's not, I don't know, the sonic landscape on this record is not, I just don't understand that description. I don't know if you could explain that better, or if that's just,
I mean, take track 1, right? Take the way that this thing opens up right out the gate.
Yeah, I'll give you that one. I'll give you that one.
And so, yep, and then, so track 1, and I feel like that doesn't necessarily at any point fully subside. And I do think it is also a function of MC Ride as well. But again, it's like I feel like for many of the tracks, there is still that noise component. And it's like that noise component combined with the yelling that's happening in a lot of these tracks too. I think that's the reason why this didn't stick with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're saying that this is like a tame version, then I don't think I would want to go deeper.
It is. Well, is it tame? I don't know that it's tame. It's extremely aggressive. Don't get me wrong. I don't understand. I mean, I understand. I'm not saying that I don't get that. It is extremely aggressive. That's Death Grips. It's just that when I think about something noisier for Death Grips, I think like Ex-Military or parts of like The Powers That Be or something like that. I just don't think of No Love Deep Web. Like, this is their minimalist statement. This, calling it tame maybe isn't quite right. It's just not quite as maximalist. I don't know if there's a difference. Maybe that means that it's more tame. The sonic landscape is just more stripped back. That's fair. I didn't expect you to like Death Grips, which is why I recommended it. But I think that I want to be fair to the record now that that's subsided, because I do feel I should be the one defending it here anyway. And it's just that this has never been a favorite of mine in their discography, and it is for a lot of people, and that's always kind of put me off. Not that you can't have that opinion, but I just have never understood it. And for the life of me, still can't. Listening to this again, it may have even grown off me a little bit more. I don't know what it is. I think the first half of this record is very strong, but again, No Love is the only track that stands up to the best of their material. And then in the second half, it gets a lot more repetitive, and the grooves aren't as good, and it's not as heavy, it's not even as aggressive. It just kind of loses steam for me. However, Artificial Death in the West closes it out nicely. I don't know. That's the best I can say about it. But I do think that this is a great record, which is why I shouldn't be talking about it that way. I think that, again, I think the sound they portrayed here works really well with the character, works really well with their sound, and complements MC Ride extremely well. I love the lyrics on this record for the most part, especially on tracks like No Love and Come Up and Get Me and stuff. And I think that the more experimental side of Death Grips maybe isn't shown on here as much as it is on some other records, but like, yeah, you still got tracks like Come Up and Get Me, which I don't blame you for having that track. I think part of what it may be, Steven, is I think that track being the opener, and it is the most inaccessible track on the record, I think that track being the opener probably threw you off and gave you a false expectation that then you carried through the rest of the record. I don't want to speak for you necessarily, but I feel as though if they opened the album on Lil Boy, you might not be talking about the record the same way you are. And
could be.
And maybe that is really cool of them to do. Opening an album on the most inaccessible song is always a bold move. I think it's really cool that they did that. And I love that song. I think it's fantastic. And the way this album opens, yes, it absolutely throws you off. And it is one of the weirder moments of their discography, the opening to this album. It's so off-kilter and odd, and I still, even after all this time with this band, it still throws me off. I still can't find a way to groove with this weird, like, jumbly mechanic synth that they're playing with here. And I think that's cool that they still throw me off to this day with that track a little bit. However, again, it kicks this record into high gear once that just, God, right after that synth happens, that just exciting ass, like, bass comes in, that exciting bass synth sort of, and the drums start fucking kicking into high gear, and it's just like, oh, it's just great. I love the way this album opens. But yeah, I think, it's not my favorite Death Grips record, and again, I got asked again, I didn't give him the money store strictly because I didn't want to give another 10. Spoiler alert, that album's a 10. That album's amazing. But maybe one day we'll get there. Anyway, I'll let you round this one out because I feel like if I keep talking about it, I'm going to keep making it sound like I like it less than I do. And I don't want to do that.
Yes, come to the dark side.
Oh no, I don't agree with you in the slightest. Let's make this perfectly clear, okay? I don't agree with
I pretty much disagree with everything Lewis just mentioned. I don't think lyrically this album holds up. I think for most part, for me, it felt like a mess. I don't like, sonically, I don't like what they were going for in this album. And like I said, I liked maybe one or two tracks off of this thing, but for the most part, I did not enjoy listening to this. Yeah.
And as for me, again, not in my top 3 Death Grips albums. That may upset some people, but yeah, it's a brilliant record still in many ways. First half's great, stands up to some of their best albums at points, and No Love is one of their best songs, indisputably, despite what Steven says. So I will. Oh, Steven, you didn't score the record. I don't want to trample on. Also, you didn't say if you'd recommend it. We're losing our stride on Get Recc'd.
Yeah, I was letting you give some final opinions. So if I were to rate this album, I would give it a big old fat 1.
Holy shit.
1 out of 10, baby.
That's ridiculous.
The first, no, not that crazy. For me, this album is probably like, again, I would put it around a 2. Like I said, I think that there are a couple tracks that I liked on here, but for the most part, I did not enjoy this. Not enough to give a 1. I think I've only given like 1 or 2 1s in the history of this show. That's reserved for a very special type of hate.
Yeah, and I
this
think
does not deserve that. But like I said, I think for me the score as low as it is mainly just because I did not personally enjoy listening to this thing. And for that reason, I also would not recommend this.
I need to ask you a question, though, and I'm doing this for your own sake, and if you answer it the wrong way, you're only going to screw yourself harder. So I hope that you can take the hint and allow yourself to gain some leeway with our audience here. You gave it a 2 based on enjoyment factor alone, which is totally fair. But I would ask, do you think that Death Grips accomplished their intention with this record, or do you think that it was a total failure? Right? Because that's a different question.
Right. And I don't think this was a total failure. That too is a benchmark mainly because of the last album that I did not enjoy that much. I also gave that one, I think, around a 2,
yeah.
and my enjoyment factor on this one is about equal to that. But no, I mean, I definitely think that for the most part, they clearly had an artistic intention, and I just did not personally enjoy that intention that they were going for.
Yeah, okay, that's much better. Good boy. But I do have a question as well, actually, on that front. What was I going to say? You know what? It fucking lost me. It fucking lost me. So that's that'll just have to leave forever. I thought it was a good point I was going to make or something, and then I forgot what it was. Hopefully it comes back to me. But my final score, I'm going to give this thing an 8. I think this album's great. I think it's mostly held up by its first half, but again, I think the second half is solid. It just loses steam in a way that an album like The Money Store doesn't. And frankly, I think that this album and another fan favorite, Ex-Military, have the same problem. But I don't want to anger people again, because that one especially pisses people off. But still, yes, first half was good. Oh, one thing I wanted to say as well, Stephen, is to the point that they didn't fail what they were trying to do here. I think it'd be hard to make the case that they did, especially seeing as the sound on this record, and Death Grips as a whole has been, not insanely influential to the world of hip hop, but they have influenced some huge artists, and not even just hip hop. On top of that, you also have David Bowie citing Death Grips as an inspiration for Black Star and artists like that. It's like if that's truly the way they're influencing the music world, it would be difficult to say that they're failing on what they're trying to do. And on top of that, I think that it's good to have a group in hip hop pushing the boundaries this far. You'd be hard pressed to find a hip-hop artist who pushes the boundaries of that genre as far as Death Grips do. There aren't many, if any. There are a few other experimental hip-hop groups that push it pretty damn far, but these guys, they take it to every extreme, especially on these early records, where they were sticking to that style more than they do now. And I think that also is worth appreciating. And I would hope that they continue to do that, even though I didn't care for their last record much. But yes, I'd recommend this. I mean, actually, I shouldn't say I'd recommend this. I'd recommend this after you've already gotten into their discography. I'll throw a curveball and recommend The Money Store instead. Money Store.
Oh, hit him with the zinger.
Yeah, but this album is great. But yeah, The Money Store is probably a better starting place anyway. Or Ex-Military, it's up to you. Money Store's their best record, though. But I guess we can move on now. And
I saw a picture of Eric Andre with Death Grips, and he was wearing a shirt that said piss comes from the balls. And that's all I could think of.
That about sums it up, I think. So, would you like to introduce what you recommended to me last episode?
Sure. So last time, for the first time in the history of this show, I recommended to you a podcast. So this podcast is called My Brother and Me, which is a podcast that stars, as you can see in the image, if you're watching along with us, three brothers of the McElroy family, Justin, Travis, and Griffin. Besides this podcast, I would say Justin McElroy and Griffin McElroy were at one point probably best known for the fact that they were video game journalists. So they were some of the founding members of the website Polygon.com. But this podcast kind of predates some of that. So specifically this podcast, the three brothers, they get questions from their audience and also get questions from Yahoo Answers and provide advice based on the questions received.
Yeah, and I have to admit up front that of the amount of this podcast that I listened to, which was a fair bit, I remember none of it.
Now, wait, let me ask you, first of all, before we go there, did you start from the most recent and go backwards, or did you pick out a selection, or what did you do?
I went as early as the 200s, and I watched up from there, basically. And I did see the most recent episode. So I saw their podcast progress a little bit, although granted, I think by that time they were already kind of settled, and I didn't notice much of a difference. I could have gone back to like their earliest shows, but I didn't. So I don't know how much better they've gotten, really. I tried to get a glimpse of that, and it seemed to stay consistent from my viewpoint. But yeah, so I think that one issue I'm going to have here, or I suppose we're both going to have here, is that we are reviewing a podcast on a podcast. And the problem with this is that any criticisms I have of this podcast structurally or anything like that I may bring up could very well just be applied to us. But I think...
No, Lewis, that's impossible. Contractually, we have determined that, one, we're obligated to do this, and two, objectively, everything that we say is truth.
Yes.
So therefore, our format and our structure cannot be...
Well, let's have a moment of humility, though, just so I can be clear, so this doesn't get turned around. I think both of us would admit that we're still figuring out what we're doing here. We're 16 episodes in. Mabim Bam is what, 420? Almost? Man, that'll be fun.
Hey, 420.
Yeah. 419, actually, but... So, anyway. With that out of the way. I think that this podcast bored me to tears.
Is this gonna be the the double whammy?
Well, I don't think it is because
unprecedented.
I don't think it is because I don't dislike this to the extent you disliked Death Grips. However, I'm also not sure I'm willing to give them the credit that I got you to give Death Grips. So I don't know if I'd call it a double whammy necessarily, but it depends on how you're looking at it, I suppose. So let's see. Let me go through some positives first, because I do have positives, and I didn't hate this. Let me be absolutely clear about that. I tend to, if I say I'm bored by something, it's unlikely that I was hating it, because if I was hating it, I was probably very intrigued. Which is why I'll often say that like something that's like around like a 5 out of 10 is generally worse for me to watch than something that's like a 1, because at least a 1 is interesting. If that makes any sense. So I like the format of their podcast. Not necessarily like the structure of going segment to segment, but just the baseline foundation, right? So they're taking like Yahoo questions and they're giving people advice. Sometimes they're just answering people's random questions, and maybe other things that I forgot. Which I wouldn't be surprised, but that's the gist of it, right? I'm not missing anything, really.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I liked that. I like that quite a bit, actually. I think that's a good idea for a podcast, and I can certainly see how it got them this far. I mean, you never run out of material. because it's not even up to you. You're not even the one coming up with the ideas, which is brilliant. I'm not even shitting on them by saying that. That sounds like an insult or like a backhanded compliment, but it isn't. It's really smart. It allows you to keep going. You know, something that like what we're doing, we have to come up with the ideas ourselves, and we're only two people. If you have a whole audience who can give you the material for your show, I think that's actually really cool and really smart of them to do that. And I like that they're doing the sort of brothers thing, because that's what we're doing. And if I didn't like that, I'd be a hypocrite. So, except there's 3 of them and 2 of us. And listen, 2 is a better number than 3. Let's just make that perfectly clear. In my humble opinion. But yes, I thought that was
fight us in real life.
Yeah. However, another thing, I think they have good chemistry. Being brothers, that's what you'd expect. And they play off each other perfectly well. However, I didn't find them to be funny. I thought the people's questions were far, far, far funnier than the hosts. And even the people's questions didn't tend to make me laugh. There was one I remember about how people would have received the Apple iPhone or Apple iPod Touch if Steve Jobs had dropped it in his first tech demo when he came out on stage, which I thought was such a weird thought, and that was funny, and I remembered that. However, if I were to try to remember anything that the brothers said, I remember some poop. I remember some of that. Balls. I remember some balls in there. A vasectomy. That was unpleasant. I didn't like that. But that's
balls where the piss is.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Not that specifically. Let's talk about the point that the questions are very funny. I think that one of the things that they do actually, because I feel like they are very aware of that, they actually close the show out by reading a final Yahoo Answers question and not even provide any response to it.
Mm-hmm.
So they usually save the funniest question for last and kind of close the show out on that note. Oftentimes, you're right. I mean, oftentimes the Yahoo Answers question is the funniest part.
Yeah.
Because some of the things that people ask on Yahoo Answers is just absolutely absurd. Like, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. Which is another reason why why the foundation behind this podcast is good, because, you know, not only are you having your audience create your material, but like, yeah, it's like when people just get to write whatever shit they want on Yahoo and they have time to think about it, they come up with some pretty brilliant shit. Like, there was a lot of really funny questions, and you know, I liked that. So,
but the take that you don't find them funny is probably the most surprising thing to me, because I think that these 3 are hilarious, and I also think that these 3 clearly have taken a lot of improv classes, and it shows. The speed to response on some of the things that they come up with in response to these questions. And to be clear, only one of them actually has read the question beforehand, even, because only one of them actually gathers the questions and compiles the questions. So most of the time they are hearing this for the very first time when the question is asked, and the speed to response is crazy. This podcast, I will mention another thing that's that you probably don't know, is quite influential in a very weird way. So one, this podcast has bred its own TV show. So they have their own,
yeah.
So they have their own television show, which is also very hilarious. And the show has weirdly influenced Lin-Manuel Miranda in a lot of places. In fact, he commonly is talking about this podcast or communicating with members of groups that talk about this podcast, and have snuck in references to this show in musicals such as Hamilton and others that he's worked on. They also get celebrity guests quite often for some odd reason. Somewhat recently, they had Mary Lou Henner on their show. I don't know how they swung that, but they've made quite a name for themselves with this podcast, and also have created sort of an empire of podcasts now, to the point where Griffin and Justin have left their job at Polygon to basically podcast full time. And it all started with this one, and I think for very good reason, because one, I think, and you hit on it, the core structure and concept of the show is good, right? I mean, it's not a new thing. Advice shows have been around as long as radio has been around. Even in newspapers, you have advice columns. But the twist is their advice is, one, bad. They're not giving good advice pretty much ever. And two, the added benefit of having the absurdity of Yahoo questions really enhances that experience too, because a lot of the times it's almost impossible to give a good answer to some of the questions that people ask on Yahoo. Like, I'll give an example of one of their most famous bits, which is they get a question from Yahoo Answers where somebody asks if it's okay for them to write with permanent marker on the side of their dog, because sometimes they'll write messages to their stepdad, Ron. And so the responses that they often have to these questions, I think, are oftentimes hilarious. And it's surprising to me that you did not find them funny.
Well, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. The sample size, given the number of episodes that they've had that I watched, was relatively small, right? Compared to 419. I didn't keep count of how many I watched. I think like 6. I said watch, listen. It's a possibility that I just happened to see some of their weaker episodes. That's a possibility. And I'm not denying that. But all I can do is go off of what I saw. And, yes, they are quick, but that doesn't inherently make you funny to me, right? Like, I did not find them to be cringeworthy. I didn't think their jokes were terrible, or anything like that. I just didn't find it funny. So maybe it's a personal preference thing, but I don't know. There's only so much poop and balls I can take, and I heard a lot of poop and balls. Like, I don't know if I just picked weird episodes, but I heard a lot of poop and balls. And maybe that was just, maybe that was just the sample, although I find it odd that it would have come up that much anyway. Yeah,
that's it.
But
interesting take. I think that for me, it's quite rare that something like this gets me to actually laugh out loud. And this is a podcast that makes me do that. And so much so that often I don't listen to this podcast in public, because, like, with headphones on, because a lot of the bits that they have on this podcast legitimately do crack me up. I would also say that as I mentioned before, their TV show, I think, is quite good. It was a short run television show where the core concept was basically the same. But instead of getting a whole bunch of questions, they got one question and then we kind of dive deep into it for 30 minutes. And they had some really great bits on there too. Like, one was they got a question from someone about should they get a tarantula, and their wife didn't want them to get a tarantula. So they go to the mayor to try to create a tarantula parade, and they go through the streets to try to get people to support tarantulas for whatever reason.
Was it like a staged thing, or like kind of caught camera sort of thing? Like, were they just doing it? Like, was it like a public stunt?
I wouldn't say that, because I think that that's quite hard to do, but they did legitimately go to the mayor to try to get the permissions to be able to do it. They did it anyway and got shut down, but I wouldn't say that it was. I would say that most of that would have been staged.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
But I think that carries over into their podcast as well. One, I think that they have a good voice in the podcast. Each of them has a unique voice and often a unique perspective. Justin is the oldest brother and tends to, I wouldn't say be the wisest, but tends to have the most wise opinion, and then often just breaks down into complete laughter at most situations. Travis usually tries at first to give a legitimate answer, which often gets him in trouble. And I think, and Griffin to me is the funniest of the three, and um, oftentimes it is, like I mentioned before, it is crazy to me how well Griffin can improv on this show and how often he can improv on this show. And a lot of those times the bits are very funny. In fact, for a while, they have one of their core segments is obviously advertisement from sponsors, but they also have a section where they will let people provide some donation and then get their whatever it is read on the air. And for a while, anyone who did that, Griffin would improv a song specifically for them. He stopped doing that because obviously that's very hard, but when he was doing that, it was crazy to me how well he could construct an entire song completely improv in that short span.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that, full disclosure. So
yeah, that doesn't really happen much anymore.
Well, I suppose that I think I know already that I didn't dislike this, right? However, I would just be lying if I agreed with like anything you you said. I mean, I guess the facts are the facts, but the purely subjective stuff, I just can't back that up. I don't. You know, the one thing I will agree and I'll give them is that they have, and this is why I said they had good chemistry, because they can play off each other and come up with jokes quickly. And if you like their humor, you know, then I'm sure that'll impress you. I suppose I just didn't. And also, you know, I found myself, again, I said I was bored to tears while I was. Never has an hour-long podcast felt like I've been watching it for like 5 hours until this. Every single time I watched an episode, I could have sworn it was closing, and then I'd look at the time and it was like 30 minutes in. So, look, I don't know. This is why I just, it's difficult for me to articulate my thoughts when I think it's purely just a matter of taste. Because I don't have many criticisms of their show. I think it's formatted well. I think the sound quality, sound mixing's great. I think they have voices that complement a podcast style. It's listenable, all that kind of stuff. This is just going to be one of those times where I just personally did not vibe with this. And I hope that's understandable, because that's really all I can say about it. So,
Wow, this is unprecedented for our show.
What, 2 disagreements in a row?
Two pure disagreements in a row.
Yeah. But again,
what a world we live in.
But again, my disagreement with you on this is not as strong as yours was on No Love Deep Web, even though you also admitted to it basically being a matter of taste. You hated it, right? I don't dislike this podcast. I just don't like it. It's whatever to me. Like, I'm never going to watch this again. But if somebody sat down and said, let's watch My Brother, no, I would say no. But if somebody put on My Brother and Me, I'd be fine with that. Like, it's okay. Like, I'd be like, all right. And I might laugh every now and again. You know, I shouldn't say I never laughed at them, but I much more frequently, when I did laugh, it was at the questions rather than them. And that's the best. I'm ready to wrap it up if you don't have anything more to say.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. So I basically just did. So scoring a podcast based on a few episodes seems kind of unfair. I'll do it anyway, but keep in mind that I'm coming off of this with like 6, 7, maybe even just 5 episodes. I didn't count how many I watched. And so, again, Steven's score and recommendation honestly means more than mine does in this situation. I'm going to give him full credit. He's heard more of this. And since he didn't specify any great episodes, it's extremely likely or not extremely likely, but it's possible that I watched crappier ones purely by chance. There's so many episodes they've done. I watched a random sample. You never know. But from what I watched, I will give it a 5 out of 10. Again, I didn't dislike this. I was bored out of my mind, but there's stuff that I appreciated, and I would not say that this was bad, and I wasn't annoyed, and I wasn't cringing or anything. I just wasn't interested. So I wouldn't recommend it from what I saw. Although I will say, if you like Game Grumps, you'd probably like this. Like if you're somebody who is still subscribed to and watching Game Grumps, you would probably like this.
Wow, that's a take. Okay.
Well, that's what I thought it was like. That's what it reminded me.
Okay, so anyway, with that being said, I would give this a 9 for me. This is hands down my favorite podcast besides this one, which I'm on. Which gets a perfect 10, by the way.
Ours is better. Full disclosure, 10 out of 10.
Yeah, full disclosure, 10 out of 10, easy. But my brother and me gets a 9 out of 10. Like I said, consistently, they are so hilarious to me. The only thing I'll say is that they have, as they've become more popular, they have done, and this is no fault of theirs necessarily. It's more a fault of the podcast medium. But as they have become more and more famous, they have done more and more live shows. So more and more of their episodes are just recordings of their live shows. And those are just not a good listening experience at all. It's hard to hear. The acoustics don't work right. You don't really get the full experience. And because of that, I feel like this podcast is starting to degrade in that sense. But if you listen to the non-live show episodes, for the most part, I would say just about 9 out of 10 times, you are going to get something that I think is very funny, consistently funny. And as Lewis mentioned, just hearing what happens on Yahoo Answers is like good enough to be able to at least tune into this once or twice, because it is a crazy world out there on Yahoo Answers.
Yeah.
And I would definitely recommend this.
Okay. Yeah. And again, I'd just like to point out, listen to Steven more than me here, because it's purely a matter of taste. And given that I had no criticisms, and I think his commentary on this was overall more productive than mine. And so, so I suppose that means I'm technically recommending it, since I'm telling you to listen to Steven and Steven's recommending it. So that's the first third-party recommendation we've had here on Get Recc'd.
Also, make sure you like and subscribe to Game Grumps. Shout out to Game Grumps.
I could tell that one really got on you. I didn't even mean it as an insult, but I guess it kind of is. Okay. Well, we didn't say at the beginning of this podcast something we should have said, that we are doing a themed rec, a bit of a theme rec. It's not the biggest theme in the world, but we are only recommending comedians, so that anything regarding a comedian.
Now, just to note, this is purely so that way we can compare lesser comedy than our own.
Right, exactly, because as you can tell in the first 2 or 3 minutes of every Get Recc'd episode, the best part, we are so funny that,
Yeah,
honestly...
hold up, wait. This just in. CNN.com says the best part of this podcast was the first 2 minutes.
See, guys,
breaking news.
Trusted news source CNN says that Get Recc'd is hilarious, but only for 2 minutes. They say, we believe Get Recc'd is a terrible podcast. However, we strongly recommend tuning in for 2 minutes and then leaving, because it kind of goes downhill after that. I agree, CNN. I agree. That was a direct quote from their article.
Yeah, it's written kind of loose, kind of long, like short form, pretty loosey-goosey, but they
Yeah.
wanted to get the ideas out there while we were still alive.
Yeah, exactly.
So we could get that, so we could break that breaking content.
They got the janitor to come write a story. Anyway, yeah, so we're doing comedians. And Steven, I am recommending to you, wrecking you, if you will, 3 comedy specials by comedian Bo Burnham. The comedy specials are called Words, 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 What, and Make Happy. Bo Burnham holds the record as the youngest comedian to have a Comedy Central special. I think he was 18. Came up on YouTube in like the early days, like 240p aesthetic YouTube. Singing these songs, these really, really wordy songs, just packed with puns and jokes, to the point where you couldn't catch nearly any of them upon first listen because of how quickly he rattled them off. And that was kind of how he gained notoriety. But he went into the comedy world, and now he has a movie that he directed that is out right now, which I still have yet to see. And all right, that's my rec to you. What do you got for me?
So I am going to recommend to you the Blue Collar Comedy Tour, the movie album.
Wait,
although it's the official soundtrack of the motion picture, really it's just a stand-up special.
Oh, okay.
And Jeff Foxworthy, Larry the Cable Guy, We've Been Thinking. So those are the 2 I'm going to recommend to you.
Steven,
For those who aren't aware, the Blue Collar Comedy Tour is comprised of Jeff Foxworthy, Ron White, Bill Engvall, and Larry the Cable Guy.
Steven, the theme was comedians, not quotation marks comedians. God. Get her done.
You can't do this. They say.
Oh, okay. Well, that's nice episode. So yeah, next episode is a good one. It'll be a comedians episode. Do we have anything to say related to the podcast? I mean, we should apologize for yet again not being on schedule. I think at this point we may as well just say don't expect us to be on our schedule of 8 p.m. Standard Time Monday.
Yeah, so I would say specifically for this month, very specifically, I would say I hope that people do not expect us to be on time. Unfortunately, pretty busy with stuff this month, but hopefully after this month is wrapped up, should be able to be more consistent with our scheduling. But we will try our best to at least stay very close and at least try our best to be within the 2-week window.
Yeah, I mean, even this time we were only 2 days off. It's not that bad. And before we were like 2 days behind or 2 days ahead. It's not a big deal. But yeah, so keep in mind, but that being said, just as a reminder, our schedule is on paper Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Every other Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But yeah, there's no guarantee of that. Is there anything that you wanted to say related to the podcast besides that? I know sometimes we have little announcements. I don't know if we have any this time.
Nope, nothing from me.
And I don't think there's anything from me either. So yeah, that was our podcast. Those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get wrecked.